How do we help entrepreneurs think about failing fast?
We have phenomenal companies, we have great ideas, incredible technology and research, but no one knows about it.
In some circumstances, what we see is individuals get really upset that if they don't do the license deal, they'll actually never get that product to market.
Walk us through the drug commercialization kind of supply chain from idea to market.
There may be a future where we actually don't do any more animal trials, and what we're doing is, doing all of our trial work in simulation.
Commercialization. What does it take to commercialize a drug? What are some key barriers we need to consider? What are some key considerations that companies should take into account? It was a pleasure to sit down and chat with my good friend Jason Ding, who has nearly 20 years of financial and transactional expertise in the life sciences and healthcare industry. Jason shares his insights on the startup environment, commercialization, and everything in between.
Thank you, Jason, for joining me today. I am really excited for this topic. We both play in this space. Really, what we're going to be talking about is commercialization and the startup scale-up culture in Alberta and beyond our borders. Your reputation supersedes you, and you're very well recognized in the community. So really appreciate you spending time with me today.
Of course.
What do you think are, and we're just going to get right into it, what do you think the unique barriers, or maybe not unique, just barriers around the culture in Alberta for the startup and scale-up companies?
So the barriers are interesting. I think we've had, a number of decades in the province of Alberta of lots of wealth, right? Lots of opportunities, particularly around natural resources, and what's available there. I think this is a province of innovative, hardworking people who have really sort of focused on one particular industry for a long time, and taking that into other industries and that draw of every time oil hits $100, $150 a barrel, that draw of talent into that particular industry has meant that other industries have been starved sometimes for, great people, great talent. I think that as well, there's some challenges, I think, of people who are focused on, and entrepreneurs who are focused on specific opportunities and, have sort of the one big idea. I think in other startup, and it's starting to change, but in other startup jurisdictions, you get sort of this concept of serial entrepreneurs. And it's not that we don't have serial entrepreneurs in Alberta, but we have many, I would say, serial entrepreneurs in the Valley and in Boston and some of these other jurisdictions where startup culture has been around for a lot longer. And where people, I think, being a serial entrepreneur is rewarded, whereas sometimes in Alberta, I think, we're still in a space where, having a company and growing that company for a very, very long time is, what is valued. And so, and there's, I would say, different ideas, different benefits to both of those. But within the startup world, having a concept of, one company that you're just going to grow for a really, really long time, is a different, I think, mindset than, what a lot of startup culture really is about in terms of pivoting and moving quickly and selling and starting your next venture and continuing to, move through creating that particular culture.
So what do we do to enable companies to pivot quickly, to fail fast, to talk about those failures, to what do we need to do as a community or as an ecosystem to help propel that forward?
I think it's just getting used to that mindset, right? And so one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit is this concept of abundance and scarcity, right? And so I go back to that quite a bit because what I find is, when you believe that things are scarce, when ideas are scarce, or money is scarce, or contacts are scarce, or your networks are scarce, elbows go up, and you don't share, right? And I would say that's changing again, right? Alberta it's been in this amazing evolution And I'm definitely seeing a shift in the mindset of the individuals who are, playing in that space and new entrepreneurs that are coming in that space. But when you go down to the valley, and for the last 10 years, what I would say is every time you talk to someone and you have a conversation about your startup and what you're working on or a client or whatever, I find, usually they're there often with, oh, I can connect you with 5 people that I think that can help you with either money or ideas or someone that could sit on your board that could support you or someone who's done this before that you might want to connect with. Like that's actually part of the conversation with, with other people. And sometimes I find when, when you think again, resources are scarce or opportunities are scarce. And you can tell when you're talking to someone with that mindset, they're not sharing, right? They're thinking about how can you help me in my particular startup with my problems? And it's not a two-way street, and it's not one where, I can connect with 5 people. And sometimes just coming into that conversation with, I can help you with, 5 people or 5 contacts or 5 ideas, and coming in with how do I help you rather than how do you help me, that changes the conversation. And so I think, how do we help entrepreneurs think about failing fast? How do we think about them pivoting? Is being part of a culture where that is part of the conversation, right? Where it's, well, here's a whole bunch of ideas. Here's, a number of people who have worked in the space, who have done this before, who have failed before, have pivoted before. And I think when people get comfortable with that paradigm, things start to change. And again, I'm seeing that, much more in Alberta now, where, people are starting to introduce others to, funders, to contacts, to other people. And that's just natural as part of the conversation. Rainforest was, I would say, a major movement that started in Calgary a number of years back. And it was really around how do we create, partnerships and collaborations and people working together in this sort of positive, and I hate to use the word ecosystem, but ecosystem, right? Where people are working together and trying to create, a system where, all boats are lifted. That is spreading, across the province. And again, we're seeing that benefit, I think, the startup ecosystem and entrepreneurs in the space.
Do you think it's a lack of training? Do you think it's because our talent's going elsewhere? Is it a compounding factor of a variety of different variables? I mean, you're starting to see it, but what else can we do to help amplify that? And to amplify our story, because we're so modest. As Albertans, we're very modest. We don't tell people what we're doing. We don't, market enough what we're doing. I think that's also part of our problem. And we have phenomenal companies. We have great ideas, incredible technology and research, but no one knows about it. So do you think it's a combination, or do you really feel traditionally it's because of the culture and, potentially some of the elbows up and not sharing?
I think we definitely have a marketing problem. Like, I think the province could, I think they try to tell their story, but I just don't think that we're loud enough sometimes as a jurisdiction to tell the story of how great we are and the things that we do and the innovations that come out of the province. We heard about this one, particular story about, hydrogen, trains being built, in Alberta as the only location building hydrogen trains in North America, in rural Alberta. And like, we don't hear that story, right? Stories like that and so many others, I would say they just need to get told, and they need to show up. Sometimes, the capital intensive stories, the finance stories, the go public stories are the ones that get told so often. And that is one thing I will say, in Alberta, what I see is that companies are less interested in going public. They tend to stay private longer, and there's a lot of challenges in being public. There are advantages as well. But companies stay private longer, I think, in Alberta.
Why do you think that is?
You know what? I mean, having worked on, as an auditor for public companies, like, it is very difficult to be public. I mean, You have, right. So your perspective as a company, I think, changes as well when you become public. So suddenly, instead of taking, a longer term view, you're forced to report every quarter to shareholders externally around sort of what you've done, for the company and for them lately in terms of increasing share price. And so your mindset changes from a longer term view to a shorter term view. And I think that is prevalent. That perspective is prevalent amongst, I think, entrepreneurs in Alberta. I've certainly heard that. But we're also in a time of activist shareholders. We're in a time where, if you look at the biotech industry right now, the entire market is down. So if you're a private company, it's irrelevant, right? It's how you're doing and what you're doing and how you're raising capital and the valuation that you're raising that capital at. You're not subject to what's happening in the public markets as much. If you're a public company and your share price is down, 50%, like your next raise is going to be done at a 50% discount for what you were trading at, at the peak. And so like your dilution impact for any money that you raise is going to be that much worse, right? Because of that. And then we're in this time of as well of activist shareholders, right? Where, you have investors who are taking over boards, who are, pushing hard for companies to do what they want, which may be counter to what management is looking to do. And so it's just an interesting dynamic in terms of being public. And I would say, when you're private, you can make a lot of your own decisions. You can take that long-term view. You can still, benefit all of the employees, as shareholders through options or other ways. Like you can still share, I think, how the company is doing with the people who are working in it. But that dynamic changes in terms of, external parties.
So in your opinion, why don't you think we have enough deal flow in Alberta?
So I think it depends a little bit on what you mean by deal flow. So we have companies, we have lots of companies that are created in Alberta. And actually, if you look at, venture capital funding into the province, over the last, let's call it 6 months, Alberta has set a couple of records in Canada around the money, venture capital funds that have been raised within the province. And so it's going to depend a little bit on industry. I think in terms of the companies that are in the province, I think what we need to do is continue to expand the opportunity for companies that are in Alberta to reach out externally, bring in more international boards, have just greater exposure outside of Alberta. I've heard, some discussions around the investability of the companies that are in the province, right? So how far along are they? What are they asking for? How do they value themselves? How much money are they looking for, right? Are we looking for 5 million because we want to limit the dilution? And as a result, venture capital funds in the Valley sort of go, well, I'm not putting in 5 million because that gets you nowhere. I'm willing to do a 20, 30, $40 million raise, but 5 million is like really small. Or companies that, value themselves at $100 million, right? Before they go down to the Valley and pitch. And again, VCs are like, no.
Right.
There's hundreds of other companies locally, that wouldn't value themselves anywhere near that. And so I think, getting some of that exposure and understanding what they're up against, who they're up against, and just understanding the market a little bit better, will change, I think, the dynamic of the investability of some of these Alberta companies and how they're going to be perceived by funders and investors. On the other side, I would say there's still lots of capital. Like despite what's happening again in the pharma biotech sort of public markets right now and the availability of capital post-COVID, there's still money for great ideas. So if you have great ideas, if you've got a great company, if you've got sort of that, we'll call it intellectual property, technology plus, a great management team that's going to take it, who's experienced, you'll find the capital, right? And that money is it's still there. Um, in Canada, there are not very many life science investment funds. You could pretty much count on less than, two hands, maybe even one. The number of funds that are in Canada that specifically focus on life science investment. And so you're going to have to go international for that. But on the tech side, there's lots of funds that invest in tech in Canada and overseas or in the US. And so lots of opportunities to look for capital there. And there is deal flow and there is, capital availability for, again, great ideas. Mm-hmm. Anything that's incremental, anything that's, a small improvement from existing technology, I think you're going to have a really tough time finding, VC capital that's going to back that. But again, really great, disruptive ideas that are very different. I would say there's money out there for sure.
So you made a comment around COVID. So life sciences, COVID was a catalyst for a lot of innovation, right? We saw vaccine development happening very quickly. We saw, ideas around drug commercialization. We saw a lot of different emerging technologies. Mobile health and virtual care, digital health was exploding. A ton of really neat solutions. And COVID was truly a catalyst to a lot of that. And in Canada, sometimes we have a little bit of red tape, particularly on fee codes and whatnot. So that helped to escalate, I think, and enable patients to receive care at the, just with a few clicks on their phone with a few different applications. And it's interesting because I think there's a variety of different misconceptions when it comes to drug commercialization. So I want to start by breaking it down. Can you walk us through the drug commercialization kind of supply chain from idea to market?
Yeah, for sure. So let me just talk about COVID just for a second. Okay. I think, and I would say, COVID was what we saw during COVID was a pendulum swing, one way, and then I think we're starting to see that swing back the other way, right? So, I think lots of discussion around, work from home as an example, and sort of, how the workforce is going to work in the future, and then, we're starting to see some of that shift back. It's not that I think everyone's going to go back to working in the office, but it's not going to be this sort of virtual home, all the time, because there's benefits to working in the office. Similarly, I think, COVID in the diagnostic space, in the virtual care space, we saw that swing, quite far, one way. And again, we're starting to see that come back the other way, right? So I was approached by a number of diagnostic companies to sell their businesses, and so we approached a number of investors or a number of buyers who basically said, look, we can't buy a business off of, a COVID bump. Because we have we just don't, there's too much uncertainty on what's going to happen to that revenue stream with COVID. And so similarly on the virtual health side, you saw, a massive spike in healthcare costs because it became so easy to actually, see someone virtually. And at the same time, they often needed to then go and see, to go into a radiology lab or a diagnostic lab or get a blood test or whatever. And so, and there was just no way for a physician to actually poke and prod and touch a patient to help them with that diagnostic piece. And so, again, we're starting to see some of that shift back too. And so, unfortunately, I think, some of that capital availability and we talked about lots about capital up to this point, capital availability on the pharmaceutical development side has also, come back the other way. Tons of money on pharma development. That's sort of swung back. So therapeutic development is, I'll say traditionally has been, a lot of sort of, you come up with a lead candidate, you come up with a target, typically, you do some med chem work, you basically look for, a bunch of different candidates that could potentially hit and modulate the target the way that you want it to. You pick a lead candidate based on, safety and efficacy based on what you see. You run that in a number of preclinical trials, typically with animals, mice, rabbits, dogs, monkeys, and then you basically get then an approval from the regulatory agency in the U.S., the FDA, Health Canada, to basically run a human clinical trial. Typically, you do a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3 trial. Your phase 1 is entirely safety. Your phase 2 is going to be safety plus efficacy. Your phase 3 is also safety plus efficacy, but at a much larger scale. And then after that, regulatory approval. And so that process is, let's call it 12 to 14 years, $2 billion-ish, I think by last estimate. And so at $2 billion, that's a really expensive process. Mm-hmm. And you have to factor in all of the failures as well, right? So lots of drugs fail, after phase 1, after phase 2, sometimes after phase 3. And so cumulative costs are very, very expensive. That time to develop drugs, 12 to 14 years, is very long, especially when your patent life is 20 years, right? You have basically then, let's call it, 6 to 8 years to market the product, typically at a high price, in order to make back some of those costs and get, a return on investment on the risk. And then the day that patent expires, that drug goes generic. Mm-hmm. And so, in the case of, I won't name it, but one really famous drug that came off patent a couple of years ago, the day it went generic, there were 8 versions of that generic ready to go, to pop into the market. They took within a very short space of time, 60 to 80% of the market share, the generics did. And of course drove the price down, pretty significantly. So that is drug development, traditional drug development.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's a key barrier to commercialization, right? What other barriers are there that people need to be aware of when it comes to drug commercialization?
Wow. So many. I mean, I talked about the process, but there's so many barriers within that process, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So, intellectual property, as an example, early on, anyone sort of fighting, claims, your composition of matter patents, how you, produce that drug. There's safety. Anything that comes up on the safety side, can tank a program. The drug doesn't work, will tank the program. Being able to raise enough capital, right, in order to fund this development through, if you're a biotech company, is a barrier. And even that sort of does it work is a tricky question, right? So does it work? But there's, status quo drugs. This is, what's already out there in terms of gold standard. You have to be, like, if you're just this much better than the gold standard, who's going to pay for it, right? If you're super expensive. But if you're this much better than the gold standard, then maybe there's an opportunity to pay for it. And so, it's tough to think through sort of, reimbursability. So then as a biotech company, typically you're developing one drug, right? You're putting all your resources, because you can't do a $2 billion development for a whole pipeline of drugs. And so you're putting the majority of your resources into one product, right? One drug. So it doesn't make any sense then for you to create a sales team, a regulatory team, a medical affairs team, a government relations team, right, to market this product all over the world just for one drug. And so typically you are licensing or partnering with a large pharma company who has that infrastructure in place already to do that. So then you've got to convince a large pharma company that, your drug is worth partnering with, and that it's going to generate sort of the sales and the benefit that, they're looking for. And then you've got to get through all of those particular pieces as well. You've got to be able to manufacture your product. And I think there's so many challenges to get through to get a drug all the way there.
I think we've heard, at least for me, within, as we're very well entrenched in the market. We know Alberta companies. We work very closely with them. It's interesting because I've heard, people, organizations say Alberta companies are giving their technology to global companies. Is that true? Like, what are your thoughts around that?
So we've talked a little bit about the challenges of building a global company to sell one product, right? At least within the biopharma space. Mm-hmm. And licensing is, typically what happens, right, in that space. And I think in some circumstances, what we see is, individuals get really upset that, investments have been made into a company in Canada, in Alberta, in Edmonton, and in order to partner and in order to commercialize that product, they've had to license to a large pharma company. But if they don't do the license deal, they'll actually never get that product to market, right? And so in some cases, it's partnering with a company. That intellectual property actually stays with the company. So you have to think about licensing like a lease, right? So I own this asset, and I'm giving someone else the right to be able to use that asset or sell that asset, or rent that asset, basically, and or maybe it's music rights or whatever it is. The intellectual property stays with one person or one group, but someone else is doing the marketing and the sales of that, right? And so. I think there needs to be a bit of a change of perspective of, who's come up with that intellectual property and where does that intellectual property sit? But how are we going to actually impact patients, and how are we going to make that difference? And what does that mean in terms of, having a partner? Now, what could happen is a license happens. So, the company is on its own, is still a company in Edmonton, in Alberta, doing its thing. Money that comes in from those international partnerships actually come back, and that allows them to fund the next drug, right? And maybe they, as part of that second drug, they create a Canadian sales team, right? And partner that second drug where they retain rights to Canada and, partner the rest of the world. And maybe on drug 3, they're retaining rights to, Canada and Europe. And on drug 4, they actually have enough money to actually say, okay, well, it makes sense for us now actually to create that infrastructure globally. But you can't expect a small biotech company to, be a global company and create all of that infrastructure when it just makes no sense to do that. That, of course, is where, applicable to, companies that are developing, single pony drugs. Those that are developing platform companies, where they license their platform to a company, let's say for neuro diseases. There's other opportunities for that company to be able to license for a bunch of other things. That intellectual property again stays in Canada, in Alberta, and there's lots of different opportunities for them to continue to expand that value proposition. And so I think there just needs to be a little bit of a reset and a change on how do we make that impact and how do we grow companies and what does that mean? And even if that company sells, it gets acquired, bought out, that money comes into the ecosystem in the province to fund other great startups, other great companies. And hopefully, a number of the people that were part of that company go off with their own ideas with some of that capital from that exit to do the next thing.
Right. So the FDA just approved the first ever 3D printed drug. We're seeing a ton of innovation in this space. You're going to see that more to come. AI is playing a huge role.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
So lots of, new opportunities for drug development in this world. I would say, cell and gene therapy has been this remarkable expansion. The mRNA vaccine being, the first vaccine of its kind with a success rate of 95% plus. That's a major advance. From a platform perspective, AI in silico drug development is improving all the time. So being able to, instead of, all of those different candidates and testing them and seeing if they hit sort of the disease and the target that you want them to, being able to rationally design that drug through computer modeling, are advances that are happening all the time right now. Even the FDA actually just approved in silico clinical trials in lieu of animal trials. So there may be a future where we actually don't do any more animal trials anymore, and what we're doing is doing all of our trial work in simulation and in computers and so there's remarkable, I would say, advancements and opportunities within the drug development space.
That's interesting. I can't imagine a world where we do that on computers. I mean, it's probably not too far off because we're so used to the traditional method of mice, animals.
Right.
Right. So that's going to be really interesting. And then what does bias look like? and what does, right? So that kind of opens a whole other door to a ton of challenges, which we won't go over today. But we talked a lot about, the barriers to commercialization, challenges within this space, barriers for companies to scale and grow outside of Alberta and beyond, licensing. If we are to look at the ecosystem as a whole, although you don't like to use the word, but I will use it for this last question. What do we collectively do if the barriers weren't there? How do we collectively come together around the startup, scale up ecosystem to support companies? Like, what can be accomplished together?
So I think we can accomplish a lot together, but I'll say two things first. I mean, I think the barriers have to be there for a reason. I think removing barriers means that there's this natural filter all the way through for bad ideas, right? And there are lots of bad ideas, and there are lots of uncommercializable ideas, and there are lots of ideas that should fail and die. And so, not having barriers or having barriers means that you're able to filter those ideas through, and people are forced to pivot or forced to give up on their ideas and forced to move on to bigger and better things. And so, I think removing those barriers is not a way that we should imagine the world. And you know what, actually, and the second thing I'll say is those barriers are actually, I think, what drives people to come together, right? It forces partnerships, it forces collaborations, it forces, the creation of a community to figure out how to overcome those barriers. And if you have barriers, if you don't have those barriers, there's no reason for that community to come together. And so, I think, those barriers are there for a reason. It's part of the natural market, right? To help filter through what the world really needs and the right ideas to solve the right problems. And the capital is there to fund the growth of those ideas and really sort of, provide that opportunity to test them out, and the right people to sort of drive those ideas through. The ones with enough passion and enough grit and enough sort of push and perseverance to get there. And so, I think all of those come with being a great entrepreneur, and I would never want those barriers to be removed.
No, you flipped it on its head, which I love, right? It's really around the opportunity. Instead of looking at them as barriers, are actually opportunities to make things better, to make companies better, to make the ecosystem better, and for us to grow as a whole. So I loved that. Thank you, Jason, for your time. This was phenomenal.
You bet. Thank you.